Chapter 34. Hans Rosenblatt. Caitlin finished tying off the last stitch behind Wolfgang's torn ear. She trimmed the suture thread, then cleaned the scissors with fresh gauze and iodine before putting them back in the kit. She rinsed her hands in hypochlorite acid, then soaked another napkin of gauze in the same. Wolfgang gritted his teeth as she cleaned his stitched-together face with it. Satisfied, she treated another strip of gauze with iodine and hypochlorite acid and packed it against the wound. She bound it under his jaw and round his head until it hid the wound under fresh white gauze. She sat back. "You should try to get some rest now," she said. Wolfgang nodded. Between the ache of the wound and the burn of the iodine, he did not have a reasonable expectation that sleep was going to come. He sat back anyway and closed his eyes. All he saw in the darkness was Renoir, with a rifle to his cheek, sighting on Sebastian, squeezing the trigger, killing him dead, his handsome face transformed to a puff of dark pink mist. Wolfgang opened his eyes and stared at incandescent bulbs. Better to suffer with eyes open than shut. Caitlin went to Finbar next. While she stitched the torn folds of skin where his fingers had been, he stared at her, jaw clamped down to keep him from crying out, looking for what? Compassion? Affection? Love? Had he forgotten their last encounter entirely, she wondered? Did he think she had forgotten it? Caitlin had not, and did not intend to. Regardless of what was coming for them, seeking comfort in his arms, or offering it to him in hers, was not going to happen. In that she was resolute. She finished bandaging him, then she left him to sulk in the corner, befitting an indignant, needy, grasping little boy. He rolled onto his left side with his back to her, the white of his freshly bandaged, throbbing left hand cradled up on his neck, as if he was hugging himself. Caitlin looked around the MG nest. At the far murder hole, Durant looked out into the evening. She saw him check his watch and wondered how long they had left. It could not be long now. The air coming in through the machine gun slit and the murder holes had the cutting cold of night with it. Night itself would not be far behind. At the machine gun, Jonah Unger busied himself with preparations. He had the spare barrel and the spanners that would wrench an overheated barrel free lying on the deck beside him. He had 3 additional belts of ammunition laid out beside him, ready to load. He was on his knees now, dropping a handful of bullets into the mill of the Gert Fuller 16 machine gun belt loader. He had worked at a steady clip for half an hour, immersed in the process, escaping into it, rhythmically using the mill to guide cartridges down, then sliding them firmly into the long cloth belt. Donnie was next to him, alternately staring out the murder hole and watching Jonah at work, secretly jealous of the fact that the little Jewish boy had the superior weapon. Donnie wished the British had taught him how to machine gun, or that the little Jew spoke English. He coveted the MG08 now, as he had come to covet motorcycles. If he had not witnessed Finbar blowing off his fingers fucking around with the contraption, Donnie would have tried to stake a claim to it. But Donnie had taken enough physical abuse for the day. He liked having all 10 of his digits and intended to keep them attached to his hands. He looked out his window and yawned. Sleep wanted him as badly as he wanted it. He rested his eyes, thinking about the nice old lady and her kind request that he visit mortal violence upon Isaiah. Beside Donnie, Dr. Halstead was deep asleep on the concrete. Caitlin had made a pillow for him out of one of the empty rucksacks. Within minutes after she finished binding up his wounds and buttoning him back into his uniform tunic, he fell into slumber. The injections of hypochlorite were brutal for both of them. She hoped they were worth the pain. She knew that was a 50-50 proposition at best. Rupert and Renoir were seated next to each other. Renoir's tobacco was ruined in the drowning, but his pipe had survived, and Rupert was not stingy with his supply. The pair sat silently, puffing away, killing time and themselves, slowly but surely. The blind boy, Adolphe, sat alone beside the door. He hugged his knees, and his blindfolded eyes rested on top of them. He had refused a second offer to clean and rebandage them, but even with Wolfgang urging him again to accept the help, he turned it down. Some people could not be helped. She remembered the line from her father's book of English homilies: "Who can give water to the horse that will not drink of its own accord?" Caitlin did not plan to ask him a third time. If he wanted aid, it was his turn to make a request for it. Then they heard a hollering from the tunnel. Caitlin saw the flashlight beam coming around the distant bend in the tunnel, racing toward them. Fear shot through her. Isaiah stepped back from the stubborn wheel. He'd gotten the gate to open an inch, but the damn thing would budge no further. He sat beside the Mastiff and caught his breath. His mind would not rest, though. It had been steadily working over how best to kill Donnie McMaster. He wished he still had the corn blade he murdered Maccabee with, or even better, the pearl-handled straight razor with which Maccabee paid him back in kind. There would be some justice, or at least synchronicity, in that. But both weapons were left behind in his haste to escape New York City. It was a shame that his vengeance would lack in poetry, but whatever vengeance he could enact now would have to suffice. He wanted to cause Donnie pain that would last. He wanted him to experience the hopelessness and desperation that Pearl must have felt when he overpowered her, the horror of knowing that death was coming to suffocate her, the knowledge that the man on top of her was going to stay there and stick to it until she would never draw breath again. Isaiah's rage simmered. The coward cruelty that would lead a man to kill like that was beyond Isaiah's willingness to understand. Soaking that motherfucker in gasoline and lighting him up in the same way he had burned the big dead German might just be the way to go. Isaiah stood up and took hold of the wheel again. He leaned into it, putting all his weight into spinning it. There was the slightest amount of play, but whatever mechanical advantage the gears should have given was not playing out as the engineer intended. The Mastiff heard them coming first and looked up. Isaiah followed her gaze and saw Francois and James come around the bend of the tunnel. "Hey, Isaiah, you okay? You went plumb crazy back there. You punched me right in my testicles." "Say, how do you know Donnie McMaster?" James asked. Isaiah put his shoulder back into the stuck wheel. "How you know him?" James paused. He was about to say, "Why, Donnie and me go way back. I know old Donnie from home, Cox County, Mississippi. Why, he's one of my brother Harlan's, may his eternal soul rest in peace, praise Jesus, best friends. After my daddy bought the plot from Donnie's daddy and made Harlan the overseer of the tenant farmers. Both our granddaddies fought together in the War of Northern Aggression on account of protecting our state's rights to keep slaves and such. And on account of that, Daddy got me and Donnie both assigned to the British Army as motorcycle dispatch riders. We were having a fine time until just a few days passed. He's a good old boy for certain. I can't understand at all why you'd want to go punching him. Once he cools off, you really ought to apologize." But there was something in Isaiah's glare that put him off. So he sufficed with, from a dispatch rider pool, "He's the only other American." "Uh-huh," said Isaiah. He leaned hard into the wheel. Francois joined him, and they put all their strength into trying to break it free. James was about to continue. Maybe Isaiah would like Donnie better if he gave him some details, so he could like him as an individual. But the wheels started to go right then, and the gate started to open, allowing some water to flow into the lock. It stopped when the gap was about 3 inches wide. Francois stood back and looked down into the gap. What, deputy? Asked Isaiah. She is blocked. It is not filling quickly enough. It should take minutes. It will take hours to raise the barge at this rate. Isaiah nodded and wiped his hands on his trousers. Hours we ain't got. What Francois and Isaiah were unaware of was that on the morning of Good Friday, Matthias Nilsson, the young, devout Lutheran boy who shirked his duty to burn a church that Francois and Unique would soon take refuge in, was marched to his death before a grand audience. Colonel Clausen very much wanted to teach a lesson to his men, an important lesson on the good of the many over the good of the few. He felt sure that the lesson would be entirely to their benefit in both the short and the long term. At Colonel Clausen's request, General Field Marshal Crown Prince Ruprecht ordered the San Quentin tunnel garrison, some 6,000 soldiers strong, out of their makeshift barracks in the canal and into parade formation on the fields above it. Their temporary job, overseeing thousands of Russian prisoners of war who built the vast majority of the Siegfried Stellung's fortifications, had ended a week past, and they were fast becoming weary of sitting in the tunnels eternal night, awaiting the final German withdrawal. It was a relief to stand in the sun and taste fresh air for a change. The old lock-keeper's manor on the hilltop that the San Quentin Canal tunnel ran beneath, which now served as the command center, stood as the backdrop. General Field Marshal Crown Prince Ruprecht himself was in attendance along with his staff. Good Colonel Clausen, chest puffed out with pride, ordered his massive field sergeant Hans Rosenblatt to bring out Matthias Nilsson. Hans Rosenblatt was a towering figure, the same height as Sebastian Strothmann, but Hans was a big, meaty fellow on top of the musculature, and he had the brute strength of some men are simply born to. Hans Rosenblatt dwarfed Matthias Nilsson. He dragged the weeping young man to the post and bound his arms behind him. He stood before him and held out a white scarf. "Do you want the blindfold, Matthias?" Field Sergeant Rosenblatt asked. Matthias was so beside himself that he did not hear the words. What? "Do you want the blindfold?" Hans repeated. I don't know," Matthias answered. Hans sighed. He spoke quietly to Matthias. "Come on, boy. Chin up. Take the blindfold." "Really?" "Yes. It will be easier for you that way." He nodded toward the 6 men who were standing behind them with their rifles at their sides. "It will be easier for your mates too." Matthias looked back at his friends through his tears. He wondered if they might try to save him. There were 6 of them. They could shoot Field Sergeant Rosenblatt and Colonel Clausen and free him, could they not? They did not absolutely have to shoot him, did they? He tried to make eye contact with them to see if that might be in the cards, but not a one of them would engage with him. They looked uniformly pale and grim. They were going to kill him, for certain. There was logic in Hans Rosenblatt's argument favoring a blindfold. "Ja, then," said Matthias. "The blindfold." "Yes, Field Sergeant." "Good lad." Hans's enormous hands deftly wrapped the blindfold around Matthias's head and tied it off gently. He patted the boy's shoulder, then walked back to stand behind Colonel Clausen. Clausen drew his machine pistol. He turned to the 6,000 men watching his performance and spoke with pure command presence. "You men stand witness. Corporal Nielsen disobeyed a direct order, an order that was given with the interest of the entirety of Germany at stake. For his crimes, he is sentenced to death by firing squad. The benediction was brief, but it accomplished everything that Colonel Clausen wanted it to. The real instruction would come with no words. He stood beside the firing squad. Ready? Aim. Fire. Bam bam. 5 rounds struck Matthias in the chest. He slid down, a collapsed little heap, still bound awkwardly to the pole. The 6th round had gone purposefully wide. The 5 that hit were more than enough. The 6,000 men watched, impassive. Lesson delivered. Colonel Clausen walked to the body. He raised his pistol. He shot Matthias in the head. He released the hammer and holstered the weapon. He looked to where Crown Prince Ruprecht watched. Ruprecht nodded to him with a seeming calm admiration. It made Colonel Clausen's year. A promotion could not be that far off. They left Matthias's body to rot where it fell. He was not a man anymore. He was a lingering lesson for all the men of Colonel Clausen's command on the price of failure. At midnight on Good Friday, Matthias Nilsson became something else to them entirely. Matthias awoke in his own broken body. It had only been 18 hours since he exited, but it seemed like an eternity had passed. He had learned so much since dawn. There were deeds to be done, and he was the man to do them. He worked his wrists to a bloody mess and got them free of the rope that bound him to the pole. First, he killed the nearest sentry with his bare hands, choking him until he passed out, allowing him to regain consciousness, then choking him back under, giving him a generous glimpse of false hope, then pulling the rug out from under him. The suffering was the purpose. After the sentry finally expired, Matthias sat back and waited. He stole the man's helmet and strapped it onto his wounded head. A few minutes passed, then the sentry resurfaced. But he was not the man he had been a short while ago. Together, they slunk through the night and stole their way into the lock-keeper's house. In the generator bunker, they killed the sleeping coal tender, Private Dietrich, hammering his ugly little head to pulp with the coal shovel. Matthias stabbed the bloody shovel into the coal pile, leaving it there for Isaiah to discover in the coming days. Matthias switched off the generator. The bunker and the reek vault tunnel below them went black. He and the sentry sat back in the light of the coal fire and watched the silent corpse Matthias had just made with the shovel. Dietrich sat up. Matthias kneeled and whispered into his bloody ear. Dietrich smiled crookedly. He stood and followed Matthias down the spiraling stairs into the darkness of the San Quentin Canal. The pair crept through the blackened tunnel. They made their way down the mule path and climbed silently onto the junior officer's barge. They smothered each lieutenant to unconsciousness with his own pillow, then eased them over the bow into the canal, where they filled their own lungs with water, trying to fetch in breath, and sank to the bottom like stones. When they finished the officers, they moved on to the neighbouring barge, where all the sergeants slumbered. They repeated their performance on the rows of senior non-commissioned officers. Big Field Sergeant Hans Rosenblatt was on that NCO barge. He awoke in the darkness and silently cursed the fucking generator when he realized that all the lights had gone out again. He fumbled around until he found his flashlight. He switched it on. It flickered, then shone dimly. He gave it a good shake. It went black for a long second, then burst back to life, seeming to have found new strength. The light caught Matthias and Dietrich charging out of darkness. They hit the big field sergeant in tandem and drove him backward over the stern of the barge, splashing into the dark canal. His head struck the stone wall, stunning him. Then they had him under. As strong as Rosenblatt was, there was nothing he could do. He tried to shake them free, but the pair held him fast, overwhelming and choking him down helpless. They held him under until he could no longer hold his breath. When all the air had choked from him and been replaced with water, he sank down. Matthias and Dietrich surfaced, smiling. Matthias lay back in the water. He breathed in deeply. When he exhaled, to Dietrich's delight, Matthias's soul poured out of his nose and mouth like thick smoke. When the body was empty, it sagged in the canal and slowly submerged. The vessel would sit there, sunk deep, until Adam's soul found it the next night and rose up in search of Francois. Matthias's essence rested atop the water like fog. Then it came together, thickening and disappearing below the surface. It swam down through the algae. It found Rosenblatt's big gaping maw. It swam into him and filled the massive corpse with Matthias's life. His eyes opened. He kicked his way to the surface. Dietrich was waiting when Field Sergeant Rosenblatt rose up next to him. Rosenblatt grabbed the deck rail of the barge and pulled himself back onto it. Dietrich swam to the mule path and climbed out. He returned to the spiral staircase and stalked back up to his generator. When he arrived at the top of the stairs, he turned the Jenny back on. It hummed and buzzed. The lights flickered back to life. Dietrich walked up the stairs into the lockkeeper's house. He and the dead sentry got to work. They slunk through the slumbering house. The fireplace was a cache of red and orange embers. Dietrich took the fire poker out of its holder and spun it in his hand. He killed the lone sentry on the back porch with it. The bludgeoned man rose and joined them. The trio made their way upstairs silently. Dietrich turned the first bedroom's handle, and the lieutenant colonel's door opened without a sound. Randolph Steiger was snoring gently, dreaming of springtime in Berlin, when the fire poker struck him on top of his head. Lieutenant Colonel Steiger rose. Dietrich led Steiger and the two sentries onward. They killed 2 more guardsmen, then found Crown Prince Ruprecht asleep in the master bedroom. Dietrich stabbed him in the back of the neck with his ceremonial dagger, driving the point upward into his brain and talking it around until the grey matter was soup. Ruprecht rose and put on his clean dress uniform. In the tunnel below, Matthias dressed Field Sergeant Rosenblatt into a fresh uniform. He slicked back his wet hair. Then he went barge to barge in the tunnel, kicking the corporals out of bed and commanding them to stand to. Orders had come. The corporals sent runners out, racing through the tunnel, spreading the word like a disease. Within 15 minutes, the San Quentin Canal's entire garrison was awake, and the sergeants were screaming them into order, marching them through the tunnel in file, back up to the makeshift parade ground, where they had overseen the death of Matthias Nilsson that morning. 45 minutes later, 6,000 men assembled in the dark, in roughly the same spots they occupied that very morning. A huge bonfire was burning, and General Field Marshal Crown Prince Ruprecht, in his finest dress uniform, was standing before it, surrounded by a cadre of soldiers. All 8 of the Crown Prince's fellow generals and staff officers were there. Oddly, they were all on their knees, with pillowcases over their heads. There was a gentle hush as the last man of the 6,000 joined the formation and stood witness. Crown Prince Ruprecht gave a nod to his men. They pulled the pillowcases off the grey-haired heads of the senior staff officers. Ruprecht drew his Mauser machine pistol. He proceeded to walk behind the line of elder statesmen. He shot each man in the head at point-blank range. Knucklausen was last, stammering and shaking. Ruprecht put the barrel to his head and squeezed the trigger, ending him. Lesson delivered. The 6,000 men watching were not sure how to respond. When the men Ruprecht had just shot and killed came back to their feet, the 6,000 became very unsure what to do. When those 8 men, led by Field Sergeant Rosenblatt, charged into the front ranks of the 6,000 and began killing in earnest, things went south quickly. Each man that died rose and joined the chaotic spree. It took half an hour to slaughter all 6,000 men. The living fought back at first. They were seasoned warriors in no uncertain terms, but as their comrades fell only to rise again and turn on them, too late they tried to run. They were driven back onto the layers upon layers of barbed wire the Russian prisoners of war had laid for them. Surrounded by an ever-burgeoning line of blood-hungry demons, each man died pitifully, then rose up, vengeant, killing their fellows, cannibalistic. After the last man expired and resurrected, the reborn 6,000 set off into the new world, conquering and to conquer. Isaiah, James, and Francois looked into the canal by the sluice gate. Water was coming through, but it remained a trickle. The Mastiff lay behind them. She had taken the opportunity to get some sleep. "Something jamming up those gates good, Deputy," said Isaiah. Francois nodded. "Oui. We must open it. You want to go in and kick it free? By all means." "I cannot swim," Francois replied. Isaiah looked at James. "You swim?" "Uh-huh. I'm not hopping down into that green mess. I mean, I can swim, but I sure don't want to." "Private, get your ass in that water," said Isaiah. James sighed. He sat on the tracks and pulled off his boots. When he stripped to his underpants, he decided that was enough, and he lowered himself over the side into the cold green water in the loch. His feet touched the mush of the algae bottom, and he found that he could stand. His head and chest were well above the water. "Hey, what do you know? It's cold. It's only about 4 feet deep. You don't have to swim it, Isaiah." "I didn't say I couldn't swim, son. I just asked if you could." Francois's laugh rumbled. James blushed chagrin. "Golly, it's not that funny." "See what's got that gate hung up," said Isaiah. "We'll work the crank while you push on it." James walked and paddled to the gate and felt down into the water for the obstruction. Isaiah and Francois leaned into the crank wheel, trying to drive the thing open. "Hold on!" James yelled. Isaiah and Francois stopped. "What do you got?" asked Isaiah. James had a concerned look on his face. He was reaching down into the water, trying not to dip his face in the muck. There's something stuck here. It feels like they got a sandbag shut, maybe." James felt wet fabric. It didn't seem like the burlap of a trench sandbag. It seemed like wet wool. He tried to heft it, but it was too heavy to move with one hand. He sought a better grasp. His hands touched slick, cold skin and hair. James screamed and splashed backward in terror. He kicked to the side and threw his arms up to Isaiah and Francois. "Help! Help!" Isaiah and Francois each grabbed an arm and yanked him up onto the path. "What? What is it?" asked Isaiah. Body! It's a body!" James stammered and screamed. Isaiah and Francois shared a look. Fuck. Isaiah opened the kerosene lantern and lit the wick. He turned up the flame, then held it overhead and leaned out over the water as far as he could, aiming its light down into the dark green depths. The rays it cast cut through the algae. They discovered what James had found with his hands. Murky outlines of field-grey wet wool, pasty white skin, a black mass of hair floating weightless. Fuck. Black Betty awoke. Her teeth bared and her hackles rose. The sound of her growl vibrated through all of them as they walked to the upper lock with Francois beside him. The lamplight flared down. Instant revelation. Bodies below the algae. The bodies of the 100 junior officers that Matthias Nilsson and his companions smothered to unconsciousness in their sleep and dumped in the canal. They'd sunken to the bottom and flowed down to the lock. And there they remained. As they took a sharp breath and an unconscious step back, Francois looked to James. Put your clothes on. What? James stammered out. Get your fucking clothes on, boy, said Isaiah, or you're going to be running in your underpants. James shoved his legs into his pants and pulled them up. He yanked his socks on over his wet feet and shoved them into his boots. His shaking hands fumbled through the lacing. Let's go, deputy, let's go, said Isaiah. Francois nodded. James looked at the pile of food and supplies they had gathered on the barge. What about the food? James set the lantern down. Isaiah, set the lantern down. You think once these drowned fuckers wake up, we're going to have stuff for dinner? Let's go! James stood. He grabbed his dirty undershirt and pulled the stinking thing back on. He got one of his jacket sleeves on, then all three of them started running along the mule path, back toward the machine gun nest. As they pulled up short, Francois halted, turning back to him. What is it? Are you all right? Asked Francois. Fuck, said Isaiah. We must go. Go on. I got an idea. You get the others moving out of here. Head south on the river. I'll catch up with you. Isaiah took the lantern, turned the opposite direction, and ran. The mastiff barked and ran after him. Francois watched Isaiah, torn. What do we do? James stuttered. The sun would be down in less than 10 minutes. Francois turned toward the entrance and ran. James followed. Isaiah cursed himself with every step. This was by far the stupidest thing he had ever done. But a pair of images struck his mind, and those images drove him now. The first was the image of the watery dead converging on Caitlin and tearing her to bits. He could not abide that. It might kill him, but he would not live with her death on his conscience. The second was far more selfish. He did not plan to die until Donnie McMaster was cold, dead, and burned to cinders, his corpse never to rise again. Isaiah knew if he got himself killed tonight, he would never see that moment of reckoning come to pass. So he sucked up the pain in his ankle and he ran.